My success surprised my own expectations. The stump was entwined by the cord in such a way as to leave no doubt whatever as to the feasibility of the wonderful performance I described. And as I assailed by my petitions from the boys, each anxious to possess a lasso of his own, without a moment's delay. As the manufacture was simple, their wishes were speedily gratified, and lasso practice became the order of the day. Fritz, who was the most active and adroit, besides having, of course, the greatest muscular strength, soon became skilled in this art. That night a change came over the weather, and early next morning I perceived that a gale of wind was getting up. From the height of our trees I could see that the surface of the sea was in violent agitation. It was with no small satisfaction that I thought of our hard-won pinnace safely moored in the harbor, and recollected that was nothing to call us to the wreck for the next few days. My attention was by no means monopolized by my sons and their amusements. The good mother had much to show me, demanding my approval, advice, and assistance, as the case might be. A good supply of wild pigeons and ortolans had been snared, partly cooked and preserved in lard. As these she showed me her small cask well filled. Then the nest of the various pairs of tame pigeons were exhibited, but her chief care was the unpromising condition of her dear little fruits trees, for, having been forgotten, they were so dry and withered that unless she planted without further delay, she feared she would lose them. This needful work we set about, therefore, at once, proposing afterwards an excursion to Calabash Wood, in order to manufacture a large supply of vessels and utensils for our sorts of all sorts and sizes. Every one was inclined for this expedition. Consequently, the planting of the orchard was carried on without surprising vigor, but was not completed until toward evening, and then all sorts of arrangements were to be made for an early start next day. My wife and friends were to be of the party, and their equipment took some time, for we meant to make a grand family excursion, attended by our domestic pets and servants. By sunrise we were all astir, and everything quickly made ready for a start. The sledge, loaded with ammunition and baskets and provisions, and drawn by the donkey, was to be used for carrying home our gourd manufactures, as well as any other prizes we might fall in with. Turk, as usual, headed the procession, clad in his coat of mail. Then came the boys with their guns and game bags. Their mother and I followed, and behind trotted Juno, not in very good spirits. Poor dog, because Master Nips, who had no idea of being left alone, must need ride on her back. On this occasion I took 2 guns with me, one loaded with shot for game, another with ball for our defense against a beast of prey. Flamenco Marsh was quickly crossed, and the magnificent country beyond lay extended in all its beauty and fertility before our eyes. It was new to my wife and 2 of the boys, and the lovely prospect enchanted them. Here Fritz and Jack turned aside into the bush, where presently loud barking was followed by the quick report of a gun, and a large bird, which had risen from the thicket, fell heavily to the ground before us. Far from resigning itself, however, to death or captivity, it sprang to its feet, and, unable to fly, rushed away with extraordinary speed, hotly pursued by the excited dog, while Fritz ran panting in the same direction. And Juno, eager to join the chase, sprang aside so suddenly that her rider was flung unceremoniously onto the sand, as she darted to intercept the retreat and the active bird. This she cleverly accomplished, but its defense was maintained so fiercely, as it struck out with its powerful legs and sharp claws, that neither Fritz nor the dogs could master it. I hastened to their assistance, and found Juno holding on nobly by the wing she had seized, while the bird, which proved to be a magnificent bustard, struggled, and fought fiercely. Watching my opportunity, I threw a large handkerchief over it, and with difficulty succeeded in binding its legs and wings. It was borne in triumph to the rest of our party, who meantime had been reclining to the sand. "What have you got? What has Frisch shot?" cried the boys, starting up at our approach. "A bustard." "Oh, that is splendid." "To be sure, it is the one we missed that day. Don't you remember, Mother?" "Ah, old fella, you are done for this time," said Jack. "I think this is a hen bustard." "It is the mother bird," said Ernest. "Ah, yes, poor thing," exclaimed my wife, in a tone of concern. "It is most likely the same, and I know she had a brood of young birds, and now they will be left unprotected and miserable. Had we not best let her go?" "Why, my dear, kind-hearted wife, that was weeks and weeks ago. Those little birds are all strong and big by this time, and I dare say Mrs. Bustard here has forgiven all about them. Besides, she is badly wounded, and we must try to cure the hurt. If we succeed, she will be a valuable addition to our poultry yard. If we cannot, you shall roast her for dinner." Resuming our march, we next arrived at the Monkey Grove, which was the scene of the tragicomic adventure by which Fritz became the guardian of the orphan ape. While he amused us all by a lively and graphic description of the scene, Ernest was standing apart under a splendid coconut palm, gazing in fixed admiration at the grand height of the stem and its beautiful, graceful crown of leaves. The cluster of nuts beneath these evidently added interest to the spectacle, for drawing quietly near him, I heard a long-drawn sigh and the words, "Aw, it's awfully high. I wish one would fall down." Scarcely had he uttered these words than, as if by magic, down plummeled a huge nut at his feet. The boy was quite startled, and sprang aside, looking timidly upwards, when to my surprise down came another. "Why, this is just like the fairy tale of the wishing cap," cried Ernest. "My wish is granted as soon as formed." "I suspect the fairy in this instance is more anxious to pelt us and drive us away than to bestow dainty gifts upon us," said I. "I think there is most likely a cross-grained old ape sitting up in those shadow leaves and branches." We examined the nuts, thinking that they were perhaps old ones, and had fallen, in consequence, naturally, but they were not even quite ripe. Anxious to discover what was in the trees, we all surrounded it, gaping and gazing upwards with curious eyes. "Hallo! I see him!" shouted Fritz presently. "Oh, a hideous creature! What can it be? Flat? Round? As big as a plate? And with a pair of horrid claws? Here he comes! He is coming to creep down the tree." At this, little Franz slipped behind his mother. Ernest took a glance around to mark a place of retreat. Jack raised the butt end of his gun, and every eye was fixed on the trunk of the tree, down which a large land crab commenced a leisurely descent. As it approached within reach, Jack hit it boldly, when it suddenly dropped the remaining distance, and opening its great claws, sidled after him with considerable rapidity, upon which he fairly turned trail and ran. We all burst into a roar of laughter, which soon made him face about, and then, to our infinite amusement, the little fellow prepared for a fresh onset. Laying down all he was carrying, pulling off his jacket, and spreading it wide out in both hands, he returned to the charge, suddenly threw his garment over the creature, wrapped it well around it, and then pummeled it with all his strength of his fists. For a few minutes I could do nothing but laugh, but then running to him with my hatchet, I struck several sharp blows on its bundle, which we opened carefully and found within the land crab perfectly dead. "Well, this is an ugly rascal," cried Jack. "If he hadn't been so hideous, I should not have dealt so severely with him. I wasn't a bit afraid, but what is the creature's name? This is a crab, a land crab, said I, of which there are many varieties, and this, I think, is called a coconut crab, or at least it deserves the name, for it is evidently very fond of eating these nuts, since it takes the trouble to climb the trees for them. The difficulty of getting at the kernel, too, is considerable. You showed no little presence of mind, Jack, when you thought of catching it in your jacket. In fact, it might have been more than a match for you otherwise. For some are most determined fighters, and are very swift too. Now let us take it, as well as the nuts, to the sledge and go on our way. Progress became difficult, for we were constantly stopped in passing through the wood by having to cut away the hanging boughs and creeping plants which interlaced them. Ernest was behind, and by called me back to see what proved to be an important discovery. From several stalks of one of the creepers flowed clear cold water, and I recognized the lion rouge, which is known in America and is so precious to the thirsty hunter or traveler. This is truly one of God's good gifts to man. The boys were much delighted with this curious plant. Only fancy, Mother, said Ernest, as he showed it to her, how cheering and refreshing to find this if one were lost and alone in a vast forest, wandering for days and days without being near a proper spring of water. But are you certain it is safe to drink this? Asked she. I assured her it was so, and advised the boys to cut enough to quench the thirst of the whole party, including our animals. This they did, only finding it necessary, as with the sugar canes, to cut air holes above the joints. After struggling onward for a short time, we emerged from the thickets into open ground, and saw the calabash trees in the distance. As we drew near, their curious appearance and singular fruit caused much surprise, and also amusement, for we were speedily established among the trees where, as I chose and cut down the gourds most likely to be useful, every one engaged merrily in the work of cutting, carving, sawing, and scooping some manner of dish, bowl, cup, jar, or platter, according to his several taste or ability. We were to dine here, and after a time Fritz and Jack began to prepare a fireplace, their great ambition being to heat the stones red hot and to cook the crab in the hollow gourd. Their mother, therefore, left them to their own devices, and attended to the hungry animals, and harnessing the ass to graze, and giving coconut milk to the poor little monkey, who had been obliged to travel in a covered basket for some time, lest he should be lost in the woods. The wounded bustard had been completely forgotten, and from heat and thirst was suffering greatly until her friendly care revived it, and it was tied to a tree and allowed to move about, its fierce spirit greatly tamed by adversity. The cooking operations came to a stand soon after the fire was lighted, for it appeared that we have no more water in the jars we had brought. So the boys proposed to go in search of a spring. I agreed to accompany them. Ernest also wished to join us, and as our intention was to examine merely the surrounding wood, I saw no objection to leaving their mother and Franz for a short time. Very soon after our exploration began, Ernest, who was in front, turned with a face of terror, shouting, "A wild boar! An immense wild boar! Father, do come quick!" And sure enough, I heard a loud snorting and puffing as some large animal passed hastily through the thicket underwood beyond us. "After him, lads, after him!" I cried. Hurrying forwards, "Call the dogs! Stand ready to fire!" And we pressed through the bushes to the spot where Ernest had seen the creature. The ground was grubbed up, and some potatoes lay about, showing that we had disturbed him and the midday meal. Ernest and Jack were more disposed to gather the roots than to follow the chase. Fritz and I alone went after the dogs, who eagerly pushed on, and by the sounds we heard had evidently attacked the boar at no great distance. Terrific barking and snarling and grunting guided us to the scene of action, and we beheld our mastiffs, one on each side of the large, respectable-looking pig, holding on by the great ears, while the animal, on seeing us, appeared rather to beseech our interference than to propose to offer a desperate resistance. In a moment the truth became apparent. The captive grunter was no fierce native of the forest, but our own runaway sow. Our excitement had been wound it to so high a pitch that this discovery was quite a shock, and we felt half angry with the creature who had disappointed us. Then the absurdity of the whole thing made us laugh heartily, and calling off the dogs, the old lady was released from her ignominious position. Our laughter resounding through the wood. "Much use you two would have been, suppose we had required help," cried Fritz, as soon as two recognized their old friend. "Oh, well, you see," returned Jack, "Ernest and I had a sort of kind of presentiment that this was going to be the old sow, and just look at our fine potatoes." A good deal of joking on the subject ensued, but was interrupted by Ernest, who drew our attention to fruit resembling apples on the surrounding bushes on the grass beneath them. The sow was making amends for the fright and pain that she had endured by munching and crunching this fruit at a great rate. Fritz feared that it might be poisonous, manchineel, against which I had once warned them, but upon examining it I was induced to pronounce a more favorable opinion, and we collected a quantity in hopes that if the monkey approved of it as well as the old sow, we might be able to enjoy a feast ourselves. All this time not a drop of water had we seen, and our own thirst increasing, we felt eager to procure some before returning to our resting place. Jack preceded us, and made our way towards the high rock, which rose above the thickets, when he suddenly startled us by a loud cry of, "A crocodile, father! Father, a crocodile!" "Nonsense, boy! A crocodile of all things! In this dry, parched forest, where we can't get so much as a mouthful of water?" On advancing to where Jack stood, I perceived that his mistake was not so very silly after all, for I beheld an iguana, one of the largest of the lizard species, and a truly formidable-looking fellow. I was glad to assure Jack that the strange creature which he had found was perfectly harmless, and that its flesh being esteemed a delicacy, it would be a valuable prize to carry back with us. In another moment Fritz would have fired, but arresting his hand, "Your shot," I said, "would probably only wound the animal, and being an extremely tenacious of life, it would certainly escape us. We must gain possession of the sleeping beauty by a gentler method." "You are not going to kiss it, are you, father?" asked Jack, with a grin. I tried to rebuke him for his impertinence, but failing, I commenced operations. I first attached a cord and a running noose to a stout stick, and holding a light switch in my other hand, I began to approach the creature with soft, slow steps, while the boys looking on with utmost curiosity. Presently I began very softly to whisper a sweet yet very lively air, which I continued more and more distinctly as I drew near the lizard, until, awaking, it seemed to listen with pleasure, raising its head as though better to catch the sounds, or to discover whence they came. When near enough, I began gently to stroke and tickle him with the wand, continuing to whistle the prettiest tunes I could think of, and the lizard gave signs of pleasurable contentment, stretching his limbs and moving his tail in token of enjoyment. Suddenly, availing myself of a movement of his head, I cast the noose over it, drew the cord tight, and placing my foot on its body, I was about to kill it by piercing the nostril, almost the only vulnerable part of a singular reptile, when Jack received such a slap from its tail, which it was furiously driving in all directions, as sent him rolling over like a ninepin. At the same time he opened his jaws, when the boys took fright at the row of sharp teeth, and thinking that the sooner he was dead the better, were battering him with sticks. But I assured them my method would kill him more quickly and without pain. Thrust my rod into his nostril, on which the blood flowed, and the lizard soon expired. The boys seemed to think me as wonderful person as a snake charmer, and the success of my stratagem, as well as the means by which the lizard was slain, called forth great admiration, since they never had heard of the animal, nor of the method of capturing it so commonly practiced in the West Indies. Now came the question of how were we going to carry this unwieldy burden. I had a great dislike to killing any creature and leaving it useless behind me. Ugh, what the heck is that? So, without more ado, I fairly took it on my back and marched off with it. As we came toward the calabash wood, we could hear the voice of the deserted mother and child calling us in anxious tones, for indeed our protracted absence alarmed them. We shouted joyously in reply, and our appearance as we issued from the woods afforded them welcome relief from their fears, although the dreadful creature on my back startled them not a little. There was so much to tell, so much to be seen, that for a time hunger and thirst were forgotten, and no thought even of the water we had vainly gone in search of, until Master Nips, having slyly possessed himself of some of our new-found apples, was discovered munching away and enjoying them amazingly, which instantly gave the boys a strong wish to eat some also. As the bustard likewise pecked at them without hesitation, I felt sure there could be no danger, and on tasting them I concluded it was the fruit of the guava, a West Indian plant which we were delighted to have. Although refreshing, this fruit rather sharpened that appeased our appetites, and we were glad to eat the provisions we had brought from home. Without waiting to cook anything, as we had originally intended. It was, in fact, high time to move homewards, and we thought it best not to encumber ourselves with the sledge and the greater part of its load, but to leave it until the next day. The ass was laden with the iguana and the bustard, and little Franz, tired as he was, looked in vain for a spare seat on its back. Our road home lay through a majestic forest of oak trees, beneath which lay numerous acorns, some of which we gathered as we went along, and at length, before night closed in, we all reached Falconhurst in safety. When supper was ready, we were thankful to recruit our exhausted strength by eating heartily of a piece of broiled iguana, with potatoes and roasted acorns, which tasted like excellent chestnuts. The first thing to be done on the following day was to return to the Calabash Woods to fetch the sledge with the dishes, bowls, baskets that we had made. Fritz alone accompanied me. I desired the other boys to remain with their mother, intended to explore beyond the chain of rocky hills, and thinking a large party undesirable on the occasion. Passing through the wood of evergreen oaks, we observed our sow feasting on the acorns, evident not a whit the worse for the fright we had given her the previous day. In fact, she appeared more friendly disposed towards us than usual, possibly considering us as her deliverers from the jaws of the savage dogs. Many birds tenanted this grove and were undisturbed by our movements, until Fritz fired a shot, a beautiful blue jay and a couple of parakeets, one a brilliant scarlet and the other green and gold. Fritz was in the act of reloading his gun when an unaccountable noise struck our ears and put us instantly on alert, because it appeared like the dull thumping sound of a muffled drum and reminded us of the possible presence of savages. With the greatest caution we drew near the sound, concealing ourselves among the low bushes and thick grass and creepers, until we reached an open glade where, standing on an old prostrate log, was a beautiful bird, about the size of a cock, and of rich chestnut brown color. finely mottled with dark brown and gray. On the shoulders were curious tufts of velvety black feathers, glossed with green. He was ruffling his wings, erected his tail and neck feathers, strutting and wheeling about in the most strange and stately fashion. After maneuvering for some time in this manner, greatly to the edification of the party of birds resembling him, but without any ruff, who, assembled round the stump, were enjoying his performance, he spread out his tail like a fan, stiffened his wings, and began to strike them in short, rapid beats, faster and faster, until a rumbling sound like the very distant thunder was produced, and the whirling wings enveloped him as if in a cloud. This was drumming noise which had alarmed us, increased, as I imagined, by the wing strokes falling at times on the decayed and hollowed stump on which the curious pantomime was acting. I was watching it with the utmost interest when a shot from behind me was fired, and in a moment the play was at the end. My over-hasty son had changed the pretty comedy into a sad and needless tragedy. The enthusiastic drummer fell dead from his perch, and the crowd of admiring companions fled in dismay. The cruel interruption of the scene so rare and remarkable annoyed me extremely, and I blamed Fritz for firing without my leave. I felt sure the bird of ruffled grouse, and a very fine specimen. We placed it on the ass, which was patiently awaiting our return, and went on our way. The sledge was quite safe where we had left it, and it was early in the day, and I resolved to explore as I attended. The line of cliffs and rocky hills, which, at more or less distance from the seashore, extended the whole length of coast known or visible to us. I desired to discover an opening, if any existed, by which to penetrate the interior of the country, or to ascertain positively that we were walled in and isolated on this portion of the coast. Leaving Calabash Woods behind us, we advanced over the ground covered with manioc, potatoes, and many plants unknown to us. Pleasant streamlets watered the fruitful soil, and the view on all sides was open and agreeable. Some bushes attracted my notice, loaded with small white berries, of peculiar appearance like wax, and very sticky when plucked. I recognized in this plant, called by botanists Marica certifera, and with much pleasure explained to Fritz that by melting and straining these berries we might easily succeed in making candles, and afford very great satisfaction to his mother, who did not at all approve of having to lay her work aside and retire to rest the moment the sun set. The greenish wax to be attained would be more brittle than beeswax, but it would burn very fairly and diffuse an agreeable perfume. Having the ass with us, we lost no time in gathering berries enough to fill one of the large canvas bags he carried, and we then continued our route. Very soon we met another natural curiosity, the curious appearance of which surprised us much. This was the abode under one roof of a whole colony of birds, about the size of yellowhammers, but of plain brown plumage. The nests were built in a mass around the stem, and among the branches of the trees, standing alone in a kind of roof formed of grass. Straws and fibers covered them all, and sheltered the community from rain and the heat of the sun. There were numbers of openings into the irregular sides of the group of dwellings. The nests resembled different apartments in a house common to all. Twigs and small branches emerged here and there from the walls, and served as perches for some young birds, and the resting places and posts of observation for all. The general appearance of the establishment reminded us of a huge bath sponge. The feathers inhabited swarming in and out by the thousands, and we saw among them many beautiful little parrots, who seemed in many instances to contest possession of the nest with the lawful owners. Fritz, being an expert climber and exceedingly anxious to examine the nests more closely, ascended the tree, hoping to obtain one or two young birds, if any were hatched. He put his hand into several holes which were empty, but at last his intended theft and robbery met with repulse and chastisement. He little expected, for reaching far back into the nest, his fingers were seized and sharply bitten by a very strong beak, so that with the cry he withdrew his hand and shook it vigorously to lessen the pain. Recovering from the surprise, he again and more resolutely seized the unkind bird, and despite its shrieks and screams, drew it from its retreat, crammed it into his pocket, buttoned up his coat, and slid quickly to the ground, pursued by numbers of the captive's relations, who darted from the other holes, flew around the robber, screeching and pecking at him in rage.